Are you overlooking key cloud security controls? In this video, I'm going to help you understand cloud security controls and explore some areas that we see that are commonly overlooked. Hello, and welcome to this video series that helps you navigate critical IT decisions and use IT services to your advantage. I'm Justin Eckstein, and I bring about 2 decades of IT experience to the table, about half of which has been spent deep in the world of managed IT services. Every single day, I experience small businesses that are making sweeping assumptions that the cloud is secure by design and that they really have nothing to worry about. Today, we're going to dive into the topic and uncover areas that are worth some extra thought and effort. So let's start with the basics: identity management, or in simpler terms, usernames and passwords, really. There's kind of been an evolution over the last 5 years and longer. If you really think back, it all kind of started with having maybe something as simple as a username and a password on a PC. And then we eventually got things like servers and Active Directory, and we had centrally managed usernames and passwords. And then that evolved into cloud services like Office 365, where we have an email address associated with a password. And so it's gone from something that's very simple to something that's now very complex. And there's a lot of controls, but also a lot of risk involved at the end of the day. We need to step back and think about how we're using this and how we're securing it and managing it. We need to understand things like least privilege access. Really limiting controls. So yes, we have a username and password that gives us access to something, but do we have access to more than what we really need? Implementing controls so that I really only have access to the things that I need to do my job, and not something like maybe the HR files or finance data, that kind of thing. If we can limit the scope of what each employee has access to, then in the event of a breach, or something else, we can know that not all data was impacted, and we can kind of limit the scope of what might have been touched. We can then also look at additional controls like multi-factor authentication, which by now has become somewhat of a standard. Back in the day, multi-factor authentication was kind of like the silver bullet, right? If you had MFA turned on your Office 365, for example, you could be pretty confident that it was going to be very, very hard for someone to hack into it, because not only did they need to know your username and your password, but they also had to have the code that was maybe on your phone, for example. Of course, as with all technology, there have been ways to get around this, right? So attackers have found ways to launch fake web pages that can then capture a legitimate code and pass that on and log in as yourself. So it's some very complex attacks that are happening out there, and they're becoming very commonplace with all sorts of automation and AI out there. So we need to take the next step. Multi-factor authentication was a great step, and it's still necessary, but there are other things that we can do to take it even further. An example of this would be risk-based conditional access. So this is just another way to, again, protect your identity and the access to the data. And that's not only looking at things like maybe what country are you logging in from, but maybe the timestamps and detecting things like impossible travel. If I logged in from Nebraska, for example, and then 5 minutes later I tried to log in from Virginia or New York or Texas or California or a different country entirely, in most cases that's probably not possible unless maybe I'm using a VPN for some reason. So we need to be able to detect those kinds of things and be intelligent about the decisions that we're making and the tools that we're using and how they're trusting us and who we are. Another talking point when it comes to cloud security controls that really is often overlooked would be backups and disaster recovery. It's kind of an interesting topic because when you talk to most people, they assume that if my data is in the cloud, it's safe, it's secure, it's in Microsoft's data center, right? But what a lot of people don't do is they don't actually read the terms and conditions of these services that they sign up for. Oftentimes, like Microsoft, for example, they are providing you the ability to use a number of tools, right? But they really aren't making any promises with your data at the end of the day. It's your responsibility to take care of your data, to manage it, and to actually utilize the controls that they might give you access to. So you have to think about things like, well, what if something happened? What if Microsoft decided to just delete my data? How am I going to get it back? How am I protecting it? So you have to think about it as if it was, your own server or your own computer, right? You should be using a third-party solution to back up things like your email or SharePoint or OneDrive, or if you're using Google, that'd be your Google Workspace and your Google Drive, backing up that information and taking it somewhere else, and then understanding what it looks like to actually restore your data. So the other thing that I think a lot of people don't really think about is how do they actually recover in the event of some kind of major outage? You actually need to perform a recovery test and document it. How does your backup system work? Does it actually do what you think it would do? Oftentimes we find that people have certain expectations of what that might look like, and then in reality it looks really different. An example would be, what would you do in the event of an extended cloud system outage? Have you even really thought about that? Have you tested it? Have you ran through what we call a tabletop exercise to kind of practice it before it actually happens? If you think about that and then how maybe your business might still operate, or maybe how it won't operate, you can at least plan ahead at the very least and understand what it looks like, what that impact might look like, and then have some kind of plan for getting back to normal in the event of something bad happening. So this kind of leads to my next point, and that's that most small businesses have given really almost no thought to monitoring their cloud systems. How do you know if you've been breached? Opportunity and the misfortune of working with a number of businesses that have experienced breaches. I think probably the worst thing that can happen is that there's some kind of breach. Somebody's hacked into an email account, for example, and then you don't know about it. That's actually a very common thing. If you're not actually monitoring something properly, how do you really know that something bad has happened? Oftentimes it's too late. I was talking to a business owner just a few weeks ago, and they went through a breach, and they told me that the breach happened on a Friday, and because they weren't using any detection mechanisms, they didn't know about it until Monday. And that's a whole weekend that this threat actor had in their environment, digging through their data. They weren't really doing anything that threw up any alarms or locked anybody out of their account or anything, but they were able to steal a bunch of information, and ended up being a very bad day, and what led into several bad months for that business. So how do we protect against these things? How do we detect these things? One example would be to utilize 24/7 monitoring on everything. I've noticed that it seems to be very common that people are now monitoring things like their computers or their servers 24/7. But most businesses use at least some kind of cloud solution. A very common one would be email. Maybe that's Google, or maybe that's Office 365. But they're not really monitoring that. So you need to make sure that you're using a security operations center or a cybersecurity firm, some solution that ties into that, because that's where your data lives, right? And it's extremely important. So you need to make sure that you're looking at how that stuff is changing and how people are communicating, and is there anything a little weird going on in the environment? You also need to make sure that you have proper logging in place, and that's mostly for after the fact of something bad happening. Hopefully you never have to really use it. But in the case that something does happen, you would need it for forensics. And that's understanding essentially, how did it happen? And then from there you can say, okay, now we know how to prevent this from going forward. We can make these changes because we can see what happened before. We can prevent it from happening again. I had an opportunity to talk to a business owner not too long ago, and they went through a breach. They had a forensics team that was brought in, and at the end of the day, because they didn't have any logging in place, things like their firewall, for example, they had a firewall, but it overrode its local logs every couple days, I think, because most firewalls without an external logging source, they don't stick around for very long. And so the forensics team had a really hard time figuring out really where this attack even came from. And at the end of the day, they couldn't really say for sure where it came from, what happened, and how it got there. And that was very frustrating for this business owner because they felt like they were doing all the right things. But at the end of the day, they got breached. They really, because they didn't have the controls in place, they really didn't know how it happened. And then they really don't know the best way to tackle that and how to prevent it from happening again. So then they kind of had to take the shotgun approach and make all sorts of sweeping changes, just hoping that that kind of tackled what actually occurred. The key takeaway to understand is that the cloud is simply not secure by default, and we need to take the same, and in some cases, more precautions that we would with cloud security as we would with any other technology that we would be implementing. While a lot of tools might be more accessible, we still typically have to configure and manage them to our liking. Thanks for watching today's video. If you would like to learn more, click the link in the description.